Hi everyone, so in today's video I'll be showing you how you can create a proper day to night time lapse or just a night time lapse itself, whether it be using your smartphone or a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. So first of all, cameras. There's really no universal camera that is good for making time-lapse videos. I use a Canon EOS 700D DSLR camera and it really gives me good time-lapse videos in the end. But if you don't have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you can just use a smartphone. And it can already give you good outputs when it comes to time-lapse videos, even during the night. And when it comes to cameras, all that matters is that you can shoot manually with your DSLR or mirrorless camera, and with your smartphone, all that matters as well is that you can do things manually by using things like Pro mode or Expert mode. But you shouldn't really use the time-lapse mode of your camera because it's not really that good when it comes to capturing a lot of detail in the night sky itself. So either you do it manually or you can use an app in order to automate your imaging session. You can use apps like Timelapse or Procam X in order to automate everything. So aside from cameras, you also have to use a tripod in order for you to stabilize your camera. Because when it comes to time lapses, you need to leave your camera out in the open for hours upon hours on end. So you need to stabilize your camera as much as possible because it's all about stability when it comes to time lapses. Otherwise, your time lapse videos will have a lot of shaking in between the images. So you really have to stabilize your camera as much as possible. But if you don't have a tripod, you can just improvise by putting your camera on something safe and sturdy. Like for example, putting your camera on a chair and then pointing your camera up to the sky, whether it be your DSLR or mirrorless camera or just your smartphone. Also, if you're going to use the motion device in making your time-lapse video, make sure to set it up properly as well. And aside from that, you also need to have what's called an intervalometer with you in order to let your camera shoot a bunch of images in a given period of time. Because when it comes to making time-lapse videos, especially using a DSLR or mirrorless camera, it involves shooting hundreds upon hundreds of images, sometimes even thousands of images. And one way for you to do it automatically and easily is by using an intervalometer, especially if your camera doesn't have a built-in intervalometer. Some cameras have a built-in intervalometer in them, but some cameras don't have one. But if your camera has a built-in intervalometer, definitely use it. Of course, you can also do it manually, but that means that you have to be with your camera the whole time, which will prevent you from enjoying the moment as it goes. And aside from an intervalometer, you can also use software like Astrophotography tool or Backyard EOS in order for you to automate your imaging session. Hey, Max. Sorry, he just wants to join me in this video. Both software are for free, but Astrophotography tool is a little bit simpler than Backyard EOS. But you can use both in order to automate your imaging sessions. Another thing that you have to take into consideration is how much light itself will change as darkness falls. So you need to have an idea of what your composition is like throughout the night. Also, before I forget, before you start shooting, make sure that you have your memory card and battery with you. Because the last thing you'd want would be finding out that you don't have your battery with you or your memory card with you, and then you won't be able to shoot your time-lapse, and that can be a frustrating thing. And also make sure that your memory card is not full, and you will have to make way for as much space as possible for the hundreds or thousands of images that you will have to take. And make sure as well that your battery is full, because the last thing you'd want would be finding out that you're in low battery, which will prevent you from capturing your time-lapse. Also, if possible, make sure to have a spare battery with you so that if your initial battery goes out, then you can replace it with another fully charged battery, especially if you're going for like more than 3 hours for your time-lapse. And one way to do that without nudging your camera too much is by buying a ball head like the Andoer that I have, that I just recently bought in Shopee, and then carefully removing the battery from your camera and then replacing it with the new fully charged battery. Also, aside from batteries, you can also use a Tesla Tools case relay camera power system in order to extend how long your camera can operate. But as for smartphones, you just have to fully charge your smartphone, and then your smartphone can already go beyond 3 hours. So if you've got all of the technicalities checked, then the next thing you have to take into consideration is where you will start shooting your time-lapse, as well as what time you will start shooting your time-lapse. And you also have to take into consideration as to how much light itself will change as darkness falls. So you need to have a composition in mind before you start the time-lapse. So before you shoot your time-lapse, you need to make the biggest decision for your time-lapse, whether you'd have to do it by manual exposures or by doing auto exposures. You can use aperture priority mode if you're using a DSLR or mirrorless camera, especially if you're trying to shoot a day-to-night time-lapse in a city, because the city lights are bright enough for your camera to focus on and adjust the camera settings automatically. But if you're trying to shoot the stars or the Milky Way and you're in a very rural area, then you're maybe better off with manual exposures. Because when it comes to shooting the stars in the Milky Way using aperture priority mode, most if not all cameras actually fail approximately 30 to 40 minutes after sunset, so you really have to do things manually. Of course, you can still use aperture priority mode early on, but you will have to switch to manual mode 20 minutes after sunset, otherwise your camera will fail to compensate for the low light. But if you use a camera like the Sony a7S or the Sony a7S II, or even the Sony a7S III, then you might have no problem using aperture priority mode in doing a day-to-night time-lapse, especially when it comes to shooting the stars and the Milky Way. Also, if you're gonna use manual exposure, make sure that your camera tripod is as steady as possible, because the last thing you would want would be seeing movement in your time-lapse every time you change the camera settings. So now let's dive into the things necessary to automate your imaging sessions. So, Astrophotography tool itself is a software that you can download for free, and the same thing goes for Backyard EOS. I will provide a link to where you can download either software in the description below. But in this video, I will show you how you can set up Astrophotography tool, or APT for short, to automate your imaging session, as well as another smartphone app called Deep Sky Camera. So, after opening up APT, make sure to connect your DSLR or mirrorless camera to your computer by using a cable. Make sure your camera is also turned on. Afterward, hit the connect button here. Once it's connected, click the edit button here. Then click the plan to edit button, and choose add new light frames plan. Afterward, you can then place your camera settings here. In this demonstration, I will use a shutter of around 1/30th of a second, ISO 800, a pause of 4 seconds to create a time delay between the images, otherwise you'll end up with too many images. And I will make APT take around 400 exposures. I will set the quality to RAW, and the AV, which is the lens aperture, to 3.5 to collect as much light as possible. As for the filter change, we are not going to change anything here. After setting up the settings, you can then click the Add as New button. If you want to make any changes to your camera settings, you can just click the Edit button here, make some changes to your camera settings, and hit Update Current. Afterward, you can then hit Start, and your camera will start shooting off. Now, as for smartphones, aside from ProCam Max and Timelapse, you can also use another free app called Deep Sky Camera to create a day-to-night time-lapse with your smartphone. The app is currently in early access, but I've already seen some people create some night time-lapses using this app. So, after installing it in the App Store, make sure you set your image format to RAW, choose lights for the type because I'm your type, char. Choose any exposure time you want. In this case, I will use 1/2000th of a second exposure time. Set the ISO to 100, the interval to 6 seconds, the number of frames to 400, white balance to 5700, and the lowest aperture possible. After doing that, make sure your camera is as stable as possible. Once that's done, you can then start taking pictures automatically. So now that we've got all of those things taken care of, you can now shoot your time-lapse. Also, make sure to keep an eye on your histogram or the things that your camera is able to capture as closely as possible so that you don't end up underexposing your image as darkness starts to fall, especially if you're using manual exposure. And also, in shooting your day-to-night time-lapse, make sure to increase your shutter speed gradually to a maximum of 15 seconds. And then slowly but surely increase your ISO afterward. And I will also show you a way on how you can create your time-lapse after shooting it, as well as how you can make the transition from day to night if you're using a manual exposure as smooth as possible, instead of ending up with a lot of flickering when you change your camera settings to brighten things up. But if you're trying to shoot a time-lapse during the night only, then you can just use manual exposure throughout the session. And the same thing can apply if you want to shoot a time-lapse during the day. So the key things to consider when it comes to making a time-lapse is by making sure that your camera or smartphone can last long enough for the time-lapse, as well as putting your camera or smartphone on a sturdy tripod and making sure to stabilize it as much as possible, as well as making sure that you can change your camera settings without having to nudge your camera. And you must also find a way for your camera or smartphone to take pictures automatically so that you won't have to intervene that much. Otherwise, you'll have to spend hours upon hours beside your camera or smartphone. But when it comes to shooting a day-to-night time-lapse, you really have to choose between manual exposure or using aperture priority mode. But when it comes to using a smartphone and you're trying to shoot a day-to-night time-lapse, you really have to do things manually. And you always have to shoot your images in RAW file format to make sure to get as much information to edit as possible. But if you want to shoot a time-lapse during the day using a smartphone, then you can just use the time-lapse mode of your smartphone. But if you use the latest Google Pixel phone models, then you can already create a short time-lapse by using the astrophotography mode in your smartphone. But if you want to go for much longer than 1 or 2 seconds, then this is the way to do it. So once you've now captured everything that you need, you can now import your files into your computer, and then we will use softwares like LR Timelapse and Adobe Lightroom in order to make the transition as seamless as possible. And yeah, due to the number of raw images that you have to capture, the total file size can amount to more than 2 gigabytes. But it'll be worth it in the end, so don't worry. So now let's dive straight into the processing. After importing all of the files into your computer, open up LR Timelapse and load all of your images into the program by finding the location of the images on the left hand corner here. In this case, I have 749 images, which is 16 gigabytes all in all. Since I'm using a demo version of the software, I only imported the first 398 images since you need to buy the software to go beyond 400 images. I have already separated my images into 2 folders, one containing the 398 images that we just imported into LR Timelapse, and the other one with just 345 images that we will import later on. Remember, you can also do this with the raw images you captured using your smartphone. So, after LR Timelapse has loaded all of your images, click the keyframe wizard here and adjust the number of keyframes you want. If your timelapse is like mine, then you can choose around 3 or 5 keyframes. In this case, I'm gonna choose 5. But if your time-lapse is way more complex with plenty of lighting changes, then definitely choose more. The keyframes are the images in the sequence that we will edit in Adobe Lightroom later on to make a seamless transition from day to night. So the next thing we will do is to click the Holy Grail wizard button here, and make sure to adjust the line graph to keep it as close to the horizontal line as much as possible. After doing that, click the Save button here. The next thing you'll have to do is to open up Adobe Lightroom and drag the Drag to Lightroom button here to the library section of Adobe Lightroom. Make sure to import the images with the Add button selected here to make things a bit quicker. After importing all of them, click the Filter button here at the bottom right corner and select LR Timelapse keyframes. After doing that, you can then make your edits in the Develop module, but don't overdo it. Make sure to maintain a consistent theme throughout your keyframes to make the transition smoother. After you're done editing, we will then have to sync the edits to the other images by hitting Ctrl A, hit the Sync button, make sure all of the things you edited are selected, and hit Synchronize. After doing that, hit the letter G on your keyboard to go to the library section. Hit Ctrl A to select all of the images, go to Metadata, and click Save Metadata to Files. When that's done, go back to LR Timelapse and hit the Reload button, and wait for it to finish. Afterwards, hit the Auto Transition button and wait for it to finish as well. Next, hit the Visual Preview button here and wait for it to finish. This can take much longer if you have a slow computer. Once it's done, hit the Visual Deflicker button and slide the slider to the right until the line graph here becomes smoother. If this button is grayed out for you, then you might have to install the latest version of Adobe DNG Converter if you haven't already. When the line graph is smooth enough, hit Apply and wait for it to finish. So the next thing to do is to go back to Adobe Lightroom. Change the filter in the lower right corner to LR Timelapse Full Sequence to view all of the images. Make sure to select all of them by hitting Ctrl A. Go to Metadata and hit Read Metadata to Files. This will take a while, but if you have a slow computer, then this can take much longer. After the process is done, you should see the images change and have a smoother transition from day to night. If there are some images that are a bit off, then you can make some adjustments to them in the Develop module to make things smoother. Okay, so the next thing we will do is to export all of these images into a JPEG by going to File, then hit Export. Afterward, choose a location that you want to export your files into. In this case, I'm going to create a subfolder called For Timelapse on my desktop so that I can readily find it. Now, scrolling to the file name section, I will have to change this into file name-sequence and start the sequence at the number 1111 so that the files are in order. You might also want to do this if you're using other software to render the timelapse, since file name sequences that start with a 1 only can cause problems in how the files are sorted out by whatever timelapse software you have. At least that's for my case. Afterwards, scroll down to the file settings section and make sure you choose JPEG so that it won't take that much time to export all of the files. You can also change the quality slider here to whatever value you want. In this case, I will keep it as is. So after you're done with all of that, hit Export. So now that we've got the first 398 images exported from Adobe Lightroom, the next step is to import the remaining 345 images into Lightroom. After they are imported, we will then have to sync the edits we made in the first batch of imported files to the second batch. To do this, click on the last image that belongs to the first batch of files. Then scroll to the rightmost corner and shift-click on the last image. Afterwards, hit the sync button. Check all of the things we made changes to, and hit synchronize. When you're done doing that, deselect the image that we used to synchronize the edits from, then export the remaining images to the same destination. After you're done exporting, open up any software that you'll use to edit your time-lapse. In this case, I will use Sony Vegas Pro 18 to render the time-lapse. So I'll first have to import the images into the software by going to File, Import, then Media. Afterward, find the location of the exported images, then hit Open. This can take some time to import all of them. Once it's done importing, go to Options, then Preferences, then go to the Editing tab, and change the New Still Image Length here to 0.05, then hit Enter. Afterwards, drag all of the files into the timeline and wait for them to load. So, when you're done doing this, you can then put some music into the time-lapse by right-clicking on a blank area of the timeline, click Insert Audio Track, then import the music that you want to use into Sony Vegas Pro 18, and drag it into the audio track. Once you're done with everything, go to File, hit Render As, then choose the file format that you want to use. In this case, I will use Windows Media Video Format or WMV, and choose the second to the last option here. You can then name the file to whatever you want, then click Render. Afterwards, you just have to wait. And when it's all done, enjoy the time-lapse. So, you can clearly see the difference here. This is what our time-lapse initially looks like, with a lot of flickering when darkness starts to fall. And this is the final result, with a much smoother transition. So that's all that you have to do, folks, and I hope that you found this video informative and has helped you upgrade your time-lapse photography skills. You can still use the same method I did here to create a night-only or day-only time-lapse, except you won't have to go through the XMP files thingy or worry about flickering. I'm also attempting to balance my time making schoolwork and making these videos. To be honest though, it took me a while to make this thing right, but at least things succeeded. However, you will still need to buy the LR time-lapse software to make this process faster for you, since doing it this way is way more time-consuming. Things can get even worse if you have a slow computer. The demo version of LR time-lapse, like I said before, only allows the first 400 images to be free, but if you buy it, you can get an unlimited number of images into the software and make things way easier for you. So the pros outweigh the cons. So without further ado, I wish you good luck, clear skies, and stay safe.